Let me put these flowers on my husband's grave.
As if he would want your cheap sympathy today.
Look at the woman standing in the rain outside the gates of the Sterling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Her name is Sarah Vance, and today, she is being buried alive by the people who should have been her family. She isn't shouting or making a scene for the paparazzi huddled under their umbrellas nearby. She is standing perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the distant stone mausoleum where her husband is being laid to rest without her. Beside her, the heavy black iron gates are locked tight, a physical manifestation of the wall the Sterling family has built around their massive fortune. Standing on the other side is Arthur Sterling Jr., a man who looks at Sarah with the cold, calculating victory of someone who has finally removed a threat. To the world, Sarah was a gold digger who charmed an aging billionaire. To Arthur, she is a mistake that is finally being erased from the ledger. The humiliation was being broadcast to millions in real time. Every major news outlet had a reporter on the perimeter, all repeating the same narrative the family had spent a fortune to craft over the last year. They talked about her modest background in a small Midwestern town and the supposed speed with which she married into one of America's wealthiest dynasties. The public devoured it because it confirmed their own biases about wealth and intent. No one bothered to ask why a woman supposedly obsessed with money never sought the spotlight, or why she spent her private hours studying the intricacies of trust law instead of social climbing. They saw a woman in a simple black dress being denied entry to her own husband's funeral, and they assumed justice was being served. They thought they were watching the end of a scam, never realizing they were actually witnessing the beginning of a revolution. $50 billion is an amount of money that changes the way the world moves. It is enough to buy silence, influence national elections, and ensure that your family remains above the law for generations. The Sterling family believed that this fortune was their fortress, an unassailable mountain of gold that Sarah was trying to steal. They had spent months preparing for this day, sharpening their legal knives to ensure that the moment the patriarch drew his final breath, Sarah would be cast back into the poverty she came from. They held a prenuptial agreement they believed was an ironclad cage, one that would strip her of everything but her dignity. In their minds, the battle was over. They were so confident in their power that they didn't notice the absolute calm in Sarah's expression as she turned away. They thought they were the masters of the kingdom, never imagining she was the one who owned the land. The Sterlings didn't realize that a silent timer had been activated the second the death certificate was signed. Deep within the digital vaults of the world's most secure financial institutions, a series of automated triggers began to move through the system. A trust fund established in 1924, a document so ancient and guarded that even the family's current board of directors had only heard rumors of its existence, was beginning to wake up. This wasn't just a simple inheritance. It was a century-old debt that had been waiting for this exact moment to be called in. The family called her a gold digger, believing she wanted their future, but they never suspected she was actually there to reclaim their past. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The story we are uncovering today is a masterclass in patience and the devastating power of the law. It is a journey that takes us from the exclusive clubs of the East Coast to the hidden accounts of offshore banks. It involves a dynasty that believed they were untouchable and a woman who understood that the greatest weapon isn't a gun or a bribe, but a piece of paper signed 100 years ago. Over the next 2 hours, we will deconstruct the layers of lies the Sterling family used to build their empire and show how one woman used their own greed against them. This isn't just a story of a family feud. It is an investigation into how the world's wealthiest people protect their secrets and what happens when those secrets finally become too expensive to keep. You are about to see how a woman with nothing became the most powerful person in the room. The cameras clicking at the gate missed the most important detail of the afternoon. They missed the small, encrypted device Sarah held in her hand, which had just received a notification that would change the Sterlings' reign forever. While Arthur Jr. stood on his manicured lawn, feeling the weight of his new crown, he felt a sense of completion. He believed the history books would record Sarah Vance as a footnote, a cautionary tale for any outsider who dared to dream of entering their world. He was so busy celebrating his triumph that he didn't feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. He believed that power was inherited, But he was about to learn that true power is often reclaimed. Sarah wasn't leaving the property because she had lost. She was leaving because she no longer needed to be inside the gates to control what was within them. Legacies are fragile structures, often held together by nothing more than the collective silence of those who benefit from them. The Sterling family had spent a century convincing the public that their wealth was a result of superior intellect and tireless effort. They had carefully manicured a mythology of self-made greatness that allowed them to look down on the rest of society from their high-rise offices. But every massive fortune has a shadow, a hidden history that the family pays millions to keep out of the light. As Sarah walked toward a car that the family hadn't authorized, the first wave of legal notices was hitting the servers of every major bank holding Sterling assets. The family thought they were winning a battle for their father's belongings, but they were actually the targets of a war they had no hope of winning. The gates were closed, but the walls were already falling. To understand the magnitude of what is about to happen, we have to look back at the origins of the Sterling Empire, a story that the family has carefully edited over the last century. In the 1920s, Arthur Sterling Sr. was not the titan of industry he eventually became. He was a man with a sharp mind for numbers, but no capital to back his ambitions. The history books, written by Sterling-funded biographers, claim he built his first factory through sheer grit and a small loan from his father. But the reality is far more interesting and much more dangerous for his descendants. The initial capital came from a silent partner whose name was scrubbed from every official record by the 1940s. This partner provided the foundation for everything the Sterlings own today, from the high-rises in Manhattan to the sprawling estates in Connecticut. The family grew comfortable in their wealth, forgetting that a foundation built on someone else's debt is never truly stable. The public only knows Sarah Vance as the woman who appeared in David Sterling's life 3 years ago, seemingly out of nowhere. David was the quiet son, the one who preferred the company of books and old maps to the high-stakes games of the boardroom. When he met Sarah at a public library in a small Ohio town, his family assumed it was a fleeting distraction. They didn't see a threat in a woman who worked as a researcher and lived in a modest apartment. But as the relationship deepened, the family's suspicion hardened into a focused hostility. They saw her presence as an intrusion into their sacred bloodline, a threat to the carefully guarded inheritance they felt they alone deserved. They began to monitor her every move, waiting for her to ask for money or a car, but the request never came. This lack of greed was what frightened them the most. It was a behavior they didn't understand. Arthur Sterling Jr. and his siblings believed that every person had a price, and they were frustrated that they couldn't find Sarah's. When the engagement was announced, the family legal team drafted a prenuptial agreement that was essentially a document of surrender. It stated that if the marriage ended for any reason, Sarah would leave with nothing, no alimony, no property, and no right to the Sterling name. They presented it to her in a cold, windowless office, expecting a fight or a negotiation. Instead, Sarah picked up the pen and signed it without a single question. The lawyers were stunned, and the family was triumphant. They interpreted her silence as a sign of weakness or perhaps a lack of intelligence. They thought they had trapped her in a legal cage that would ensure she remained a guest in her own life, never realizing that by signing that document, she was setting the stage for their own downfall. While the family was busy celebrating their perceived victory, they launched a secret campaign to destroy Sarah's reputation before she could even say her vows. They hired high-priced investigators to scour her past, looking for any mistake they could use as leverage. They found a woman who had spent years studying genealogy and the history of American finance, often visiting the same archives where the Sterlings' early records were kept. They saw this as evidence of her being a calculated climber, someone who had targeted the family with surgical precision. They leaked carefully curated stories to the tabloids, painting her as a modern-day enchantress who had cast a spell over the vulnerable David. The media ran with it, creating the gold digger persona that would follow her to the gates of the funeral. The Sterlings were playing a game of public relations, while Sarah was playing a game of historical accountability. The true nature of the $50 billion trust fund lies in a document known as the Vance-Sterling Covenant of 1924. It was a contract of partnership that included a clause so specific and so restrictive that it was meant to be forgotten. The clause stated that the Sterling family were merely stewards of the fortune, and their right to manage it was contingent on their treatment of the Vance heirs. If a Sterling ever attempted to intentionally disenfranchise a member of the Vance bloodline through legal trickery or public slander, the entire estate would revert to the Vance family immediately. The Sterlings had spent 80 years trying to make the Vance name disappear, and in their arrogance, they never checked the maiden name of Sarah's grandmother. They had spent months calling her a gold digger in the press, providing the exact evidence required to prove they had violated the covenant. Their own greed had become the key to their destruction. As the rain continued to fall on the mourners in Greenwich, Arthur Jr. felt a sense of peace that only comes with absolute power. He watched Sarah's car drive away and turned to his lawyer, asking when they could begin the process of liquidating David's share of the estate. He wanted to erase every trace of his brother's marriage as quickly as possible. The lawyer, a man who had served the family for decades, looked down at his phone and went pale. He had just received an automated alert from the New York Stock Exchange and the Federal Reserve. The Sterling accounts, which held the liquid assets for all their global operations, had been flagged for an ownership audit. It wasn't a glitch or a routine check. It was a full-scale freeze of every dollar the family thought they owned. The master of the house was suddenly standing on a lawn he no longer legally possessed. The mechanism of the trust was designed to be absolute and swift, leaving no room for the delays that typically favor the wealthy. In the eyes of the law, the moment the Sterlings used their influence to block Sarah from the estate, they had defaulted on a 100-year-old agreement. The $50 billion wasn't just sitting in a bank. It was tied to the title of every piece of land, every share of stock, and every intellectual property the family claimed. Sarah Vance hadn't married David for his money. She had married him to bring him home to a legacy he didn't even know he was part of. She had endured the insults and the locked gates because she knew that the louder the Sterlings yelled, the more they proved her case. The woman they mocked as a parasite was now the only person who could sign their paychecks. The gold digger had just inherited the mountain. The panic that set in within the Sterling household was not the loud, frantic screaming of the poor, but the quiet, suffocating terror of the ultra-wealthy losing their grip. Arthur Jr. sat in his father's study, surrounded by mahogany bookshelves and the scent of expensive cigars, staring at a laptop screen that refused to authorize his login. He called the family's lead counsel, a man who had successfully buried scandals for 3 generations, only to find that the firm's retainer had been rejected by the banking system. For the first time in his life, the Sterling name carried no weight. It was as if he had been erased from the financial world in a single afternoon. He looked out the window at the rain, the same rain that Sarah Vance had stood in only hours before, and he felt a cold realization that the rules of the game had fundamentally changed without his consent. While Arthur scrambled to find a way to pay his own staff, a team of high-profile forensic accountants and constitutional lawyers was setting up a temporary headquarters in a modest office building in downtown Stamford. These were not the flashy, media-hungry attorneys the Sterlings were used to dealing with. These were the ghosts of the legal world, people who specialized in the recovery of stolen legacies and the enforcement of forgotten treaties. Sarah Vance sat at the head of a long table covered in maps, ledgers, and genealogical charts that traced the Vance bloodline back to the mid-19th century. She was no longer the grieving widow or the tabloid villain. She was the architect of a systematic reclamation project. Every move she had made over the last 3 years, from her choice of library to the way she signed the prenuptial agreement, was a calculated step toward this specific moment. The family's first counterattack was a predictable attempt to characterize the freeze as a technical error or a coordinated cyber attack. They used their remaining influence to pressure local media outlets to run stories about foreign interference in the Sterling estate. But the narrative wouldn't stick because the evidence was being filed in public courtrooms, one document at a time. The Vance-Sterling Covenant was no longer a myth whispered in the backrooms of private clubs. It was a matter of public record. Journalists began to dig into the archives, finding that the Vance family had once been the primary financiers of the East Coast's industrial expansion before they mysteriously vanished from the records in 1929. The Sterlings had built their castle on the ruins of a burned-out house, and now the original owners were back to collect the rent with a century's worth of interest. The most damning piece of evidence wasn't the contract itself, but a series of letters written by Arthur Sterling Sr. in the weeks leading up to his death. These letters, which Sarah had discovered in a hidden compartment of an old desk David had inherited, proved that the patriarch knew exactly who she was from the very beginning. He didn't see her as an enemy. He saw her as a way to correct the greatest mistake of his life. In his own handwriting, Arthur Sr. confessed to the betrayal of the Vance family and detailed how he had helped manipulate the legal system to keep them in poverty for decades. He knew his own children were incompetent and greedy, and he realized that if the fortune stayed with them, it would be squandered within a generation. He chose to help Sarah because he wanted the Sterling name to mean something again, even if it meant destroying his own heirs. As the legal battle intensified, the Sterlings attempted to use their last remaining asset, their social standing. They organized a massive charity gala, hoping to project an image of stability and garner support from their peers in the elite circles of New York society. They invited the governors, the CEOs, and the old money families who had stood by them for decades. But as the guests arrived, they found the doors guarded by federal marshals instead of private security. A court order had been issued to seize the property and all its contents as collateral for the Vance Trust. The high society crowd watched in disbelief as Arthur Jr. was escorted off the premises in his tuxedo, unable to even take his car keys with him. The image of the gold digger was replaced by the reality of a family whose entire existence was a borrowed luxury they could no longer afford. The investigation then moved into the offshore accounts that the Sterlings had used to hide their wealth from the IRS and their own business partners. Sarah's team had been monitoring these accounts for months, waiting for the family to attempt a massive transfer of funds. When the freeze was initiated, the family tried to move nearly $6 billion to a bank in the Cayman Islands, unaware that they were walking directly into a trap. By attempting to move the money during a legal audit, they triggered international anti-money laundering protocols that allowed the authorities to seize the accounts in their entirety. The Sterlings were so focused on protecting their lifestyle that they provided the final proof of their own corruption. The woman who had been mocked for her modest background had just outmaneuvered the most sophisticated financial minds in the country by simply being patient. To the public, the fall of the Sterling dynasty was a shocking event, a black swan that no one could have seen coming. But to those who understand the mechanics of power, it was an inevitable consequence of a family that valued their image more than their foundation. Sarah Vance didn't just take their money, she took their history. She began the process of rebranding the Sterling assets under the Vance name, effectively erasing Arthur Jr. and his siblings from the business world. The boardrooms that once trembled at the mention of a Sterling were now being managed by the woman who had stood in the rain outside the gate. The transition was seamless, a testament to the fact that the money didn't care who held the pen, as long as the signature was valid. The Sterlings were left with nothing but their pride, which was a currency that no one was willing to accept. The final phase of the trust activation involved the distribution of the $50 billion. Sarah didn't keep the money for herself or buy yachts and private jets. She established a series of endowments designed to rebuild the communities that the Sterling family had exploited over the last century. She funded public libraries, vocational schools, and community hospitals, naming each one after the ancestors the Sterlings had tried to forget. She turned the family's Connecticut estate into a public park and a research center for historical justice. By the time the legal dust settled, the Sterling name was a ghost, a cautionary tale taught in business schools about the dangers of unchecked arrogance. Sarah Vance had proven that the most effective way to win a war is to let your enemies think they have already won. She didn't just activate a trust fund, she activated a new era of accountability. The final meeting between the remnants of the Sterling family and Sarah Vance took place in a setting that was remarkably ordinary, a stark contrast to the opulence the family had fought so desperately to maintain. Arthur Jr. sat across from Sarah in a sterile government office, his expensive suit now looking out of place in a room filled with auditors and cold, fluorescent light. He tried to offer a settlement, a final attempt to bargain for a fraction of the life he believed was his birthright. But Sarah didn't look at the check he pushed across the table. She looked through him. She explained that the time for negotiations had ended decades ago, when his father first decided that the Vance family was a resource to be consumed rather than a partner to be respected. There was no anger in her voice, only the steady, rhythmic sound of a debt being settled. The man who had once blocked her from a funeral was now begging for an audience, and he found that silence was the only answer he would receive. The legal system, which had for so long served as a shield for the Sterling interests, finally turned into a mirror, reflecting their own actions back at them with devastating clarity. Every offshore shell company and hidden trust was dismantled with the same surgical precision the family had once used to exploit their competitors. The siblings, who had never worked a day in their lives, were forced to navigate a reality where their names provided no leverage and their credit cards no longer functioned. They weren't sent to prison. They were simply returned to the world they had spent their lives looking down upon. They had to find jobs, pay rent, and live within the means of ordinary citizens, a fate they considered worse than any criminal sentence. The Sterling Empire didn't collapse with a sudden explosion. It evaporated, leaving behind a vacuum that Sarah Vance filled with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this transition her entire life. David and Sarah chose to move away from the noise of the headlines, settling into a life that prioritized the legacy of the Vance name over the notoriety of the Sterling fortune. They became the silent guardians of a wealth that was now working to repair the very foundations of the society the Sterlings had ignored for over a century. The public's perception of the gold digger shifted as the truth of the 1924 Covenant became common knowledge. People realized that the story they had been told by the media was a carefully constructed fiction designed to protect the guilty and punish the innocent. Sarah Vance didn't just win a court case. She restored a sense of equilibrium to a system that had been tilted in one direction for far too long. The lesson of the Sterling fall was clear. Wealth can buy a great deal of influence, but it can never truly own the truth once that truth is brought into the light. As we look back on this remarkable series of events, we are reminded that the labels society places on us are often the very tools used by those in power to keep us from our true inheritance. The Sterling family thought they were protecting a fortune, but they were actually guarding a prison of their own making. Sarah Vance showed the world that patience, coupled with an unwavering commitment to the history of one's own bloodline, can dismantle even the most formidable dynasties. She didn't seek revenge, she sought restoration, and in doing so, she changed the definition of what it means to be successful. It is a story that forces us to look at our own lives and ask what we are truly building and who we are building it for. Was justice served in the end, or was it simply a case of one power replacing another? Let us know in the comments what you think about Sarah's final move and whether you would have had the strength to wait as long as she did to claim what was yours.